Good morning, and thank you all for attending today and supporting our veterans and their families by your presence, by your acclamation. I'll begin by acknowledging we're standing on Ngunnawal country here and pay my respects to elders past and present. This is a beautiful part of Australia, and I thank them for looking after this country for us for generation after generation, and pay respects to elders past and present, and very mindful today of our obligations to the younger generation. Could I acknowledge Her Excellency Ms Caroline Kennedy, Ambassador of the United States of America, His Excellency Mr Amir Mailmon, the Ambassador of Israel, members of the Diplomatic Corps, the Honourable Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister, General Angus Campbell, Chief of the Defence Force, senior members of the Australian Defence Force, Lieutenant General Kamal Yeni, the Commander of the Aegean Army, Turkey, the Honourable Kim Beazley, Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial. To the staff and volunteers of the War Memorial, thank you for your dedication. Staff and members of the Returned Services Leagues, to our veterans, servicemen and women and their families. It's always an honour and a privilege to participate in one of our nation's most solemn and important ceremonies. On Anzac Day, we come together to honour those who have served, those who continue to serve, and importantly, the families that support them. We reflect on their collective sacrifices and what their service has meant to our nation. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the end of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. Today, I particularly want to acknowledge the service of more than 60,000 Australians who served in that conflict, the 523 men who gave their lives in the service of our nation, the impact of that service and loss on their loved ones, and the physical and mental trauma that many carried and many still carry. There is a second anniversary being marked today. Earlier, I had the great privilege of leading the contingent marching to mark the 30th anniversary of Australia's commitment to Somalia. They're marching for each other and in memory of Lance Corporal Shannon McElhaney. Vietnam and Somalian operations were different in scale, duration and intensity, but they were very strongly linked. They are linked because it was Vietnam veterans who taught the Somalia generation of servicemen and women our military skills and what it means to wear your country's uniform. In my own experience, one of my small arms or weapons instructors at Duntroon was Warrant Officer Class 2, Keith Payne, Victoria Cross. In the first platoon I commanded after graduation, my platoon sergeant and section commanders were all veterans of the Vietnam War. Like many others at the time, I was fortunate to be schooled by those with deep military and combat experience. Each generation learns from those who have served before, just as the Vietnam generation learnt from those who had served in the Second World War, Korea, and on the Malay Peninsula. We are also linked by the shared experience of serving together, perhaps that emotion we refer to as mateship. Marching with your mates is one of the most satisfying of life's experiences. The mix of feelings I have today would be common to all veterans. The pleasure of seeing old friends and colleagues, pride in the job undertaken for Australia in difficult circumstances, and in the shared and private moments of reflection on our service and of those no longer with us. And there is another intangible link. Australian servicemen and women are custodians of a legacy that began more than 100 years ago. Regardless of when or where service occurred, whether it was you who wore the uniform or a loved one, or if you simply acknowledge what service of others has meant to our country, all Australians, own and are part of the same legacy, the Anzac legacy. Indeed, many of my soldiers before we deployed, when talking with them, when you asked them what were they most concerned about, it wasn't about them. It was about whether they would be good enough to uphold the legacy that had been passed to them. Anzac Day brings that legacy into focus. And the effect of that legacy goes beyond military service, though. It's inherent in who we are and who we aspire to be as Australians. We see the characteristics we ascribe to the Anzac legacy: mateship, sacrifice, courage and endurance expressed across our communities. As a nation, we have seen examples of that legacy in the way we responded to cyclones, floods, pandemic, fire and drought. And today I want to particularly highlight a great Australian organisation that embodies that legacy, Legacy Australia. A great Australian organisation that this year celebrates 100 years of service to our country. Legacy is underpinned by the compassion, the generosity and the determination of generations of Australians fulfilling the promise made to a dying comrade in the trenches of the West, on the Western Front. I'll look after the missus and the kids. It's a commitment that endures to this day as Legacy supports the families of our modern veterans. We are a people who care and we look after our mates and our neighbours. That is part of the Anzac legacy that we are all part of and that we all own. In this centenary year, I encourage all Australians to continue to support Legacy Australia. We owe a great debt to those who have served our nation and to their families. We particularly note the service of Vietnam and Somalia veterans today and their families and thank them for their contribution to our nation. I extend a heartfelt thank you to all veterans and current serving women of the Australian Defence Force, lest we forget.